I talked about scenarios of greenhouse gas emissions and technical options for greenhouse gas emission reduction. I'm now going to talk about the costs of greenhouse gas emission reduction, and I'm going to do so in 3 chapters, starting with the modeling. The costs of greenhouse gas emission reduction are real and they are positive. Intuitively, if there's no climate policy, you are free to emit as much CO2 as you want. You can dump it for free into the atmosphere. With a climate policy, for instance a carbon tax, you have to pay for the emissions you emit, and that is going to cost. It may also be that the climate policy does not go through carbon tax but for a technological mandate, and then you are forced to use technology that you otherwise would not have used, and that is also going to cost you money. So with climate policy, emissions are costly. Without climate policy, emissions are free. Alternatively, mathematically, climate policy puts an extra constraint on the energy system. Grants will tell you that if you add a constraint to a maximization problem, then your objective function must decrease, provided that the constraint bites, provided that you really reduce your emissions. So climate policy, greenhouse gas emission reduction is going to cost money. The more interesting question is how much. And there's a whole bunch of studies that try and estimate this. What you're looking at here is a somewhat older study. There's a range of models that look at the problem of emission reduction. There's a range of policy targets. But the implementation of the policy is always first best. That is, there is a uniform carbon tax that rises a la hoteling over time. Now what you see is that the marginal costs vary quite wildly. If you look at this particular column here, same target, same policy, but different models. Some models say it's going to cost you 4, other models are saying it's going to cost you 43 or even 51. Best seen graphically, some slightly different scenarios. So these are the models again, and this is the marginal cost, the carbon tax that is imposed. Some models say, well, we can do this with a $1 carbon tax, and other models say we can do it with a $20 carbon tax. That's quite a wide range. This is true at the margin. It's also true in total. So this is the same study, same models, same targets. Focus on this column here. Some models say this policy is going to cost you 4 trillion. Other models say this policy is going to cost you 44 trillion. That's a factor of 11 difference. And the question is, how come? How can different models give so very different results? But before we go there, what is the scale of this problem? Is $4 trillion a lot of money? Is $44 trillion a lot of money? Well, compared to your bank account, it is. Even Vladimir Putin, the richest man on the planet, would say, well, 4 trillion is a lot of money. But it isn't really. 4 trillion is number that you see here. Total income on the world is around $75 trillion, and then the 4 trillion actually looks smaller already. But this is not an annual number. This is the net present value over the entire century. This is what it's going to cost us over the next 80 years to cut emissions. And if you calculate the net present value of the expected income over the same period, then we have something like $4,000 trillion. And then this 44 trillion seems like a small number. It is 0.1%. And that is how you should think about it. Climate policy, if implemented smartly with a reasonable target, is actually fairly cheap. And the reason for that is twofold. First, on a cost basis, energy, fuels account for 2 or 3% of the world economy. which immediately implies that if you double the cost of energy, it's not going to cost you a whole lot of money. That is not very expensive, and that is because we don't pay so much for energy. Energy is just a small part of the world economy. But if you recall the discussion of the technical options to reduce emissions, we're not talking, definitely not for power generation, we're not talking about a doubling of the cost of electricity if we want to go carbon free. It's much smaller than that. Solar and wind are only a little bit more expensive at the moment than coal and gas. For transport, for home heating, the costs are larger, but they're also coming down rapidly. And this is not what it would cost if we would do it today with today's technologies. No, this is what it would cost if we have a program of emission reduction over the next century or so. And that explains why, even at the high end of the range, the 44 trillion, it is actually a fairly small number. But how come models differ so much? Well, that actually also tells you something about emission reduction and what it would take. So the first reason why models differ is to do with price and substitution elasticities. So going back to a carbon tax, if you impose a small carbon tax and everybody small carbon tax on transport, for instance, and everybody all of a sudden switches to an electric vehicle, but if the price responsiveness is great, your price elasticity is great, then it would cost very little to reduce emissions, because a small signal gets a lot done. Small price signal gets a lot done. Alternatively, if people do not respond to price that much, then you need a large price hike, and that means you impose a large net rate loss on the economy, and then your costs are high. So the question is, how large are your price elasticities? How much does demand fall if the price goes up? But also, what are your substitution elasticities? How cheap are the alternatives relative to the things that you would now use? And how easy is it to switch to alternative fuels? The problem here is that estimating elasticities is difficult, and different modelers would have made different choices about their price and the substitution elasticities, because it is simply hard to estimate these things. Closely related to this is the fact that a lot of emissions are set in stone. Your transport emissions, your commuting emissions, are determined by the car that you drive. And if the price of petrol goes up by a little bit, you do not all of a sudden buy a new car. So very simply, not a lot of response there. But of course, at one point, you're going to replace your car, and if the price of fuel has gone up, you're going to replace it with a more fuel-efficient model. So the question then is, how long is the lifetime of a car? Similarly, the energy use of a building is determined by its structural characteristics, and then the question is, what is the lifetime of a building, but also by the energy system that you use. And again, if the price of gas goes up by a little bit, you're not going to replace your heating system, but at one point your heating system is going to die and you have to get a new one. And then if the price of energy has gone up, you would put in a more fuel efficient one. Now, so the models, the different models that you looked at, make different assumptions about the lifetime of capital. Again, this is because it's a difficult empirical problem. You can't just look up a number, and it's not the case that every car is replaced after exactly 10 years. Those things vary empirically. There's not particularly good data on all these things. So that means that people have to make assumptions, and this explains partly why some models respond very strongly to a small price signal, and other models are much more sluggish. And the second reason why some models say abatement costs are low and some models say they're higher has to do with the availability of technological options to reduce greenhouse gases. If you assume that there are no political or social constraints on the expansion of nuclear power or on the expansion of hydropower, then emission reduction is relatively cheap. If, on the other hand, you think, well, nuclear power is very unpopular and hydropower is even more unpopular, then you cannot build these things, and that means that your emission reduction is more expensive. Similarly, if you believe that there are electric vehicles, but there's no hydrogen vehicles, that fuel cell vehicles will never take off, well, electric engines are good to drive a car, but they're a bit hopeless, quite hopeless, for such things as trucks or ships. The engines are simply not powerful enough. Well, then you have a problem. Whereas if you assume that hydrogen and fuel cell engines are relatively are sort of just around the corner, then it is a lot cheaper to reduce emissions, and it's a lot cheaper to decarbonize heavy transport. We don't know these things. Emission reduction is all about switching from fossil fuels to renewables. Well, if you believe that renewables are cheaper than another model, then the cost of emission reduction in your model are lower as well. So that is a third reason. I think, well, you can just look this up. No, you can't just look this up. These are typically commercial secrets, what it really costs to make electricity. That's not something that you can look up, and different people have had different opinions about these things. And there's also a whole bunch of hidden costs that come, or typically hidden costs that come beyond sort of the nameplate if I want to buy a particular type of machine or a particular type of solar panel. Now that is true today, that a lot of the real costs of fuel use are not that transparent, but of course we're not just talking about what are the costs of emission reduction today, we're talking about what are the costs of emission reduction from now until the year 2100 or beyond. And there, if you believe that the cost of solar is going to continue to fall by 20% per year, then emission reduction is cheap. Whereas if you think, well, perhaps the cost fall will slow down to 10% cost reduction per year, then it's going to be more expensive to reduce emissions. And of course, what matters is not the absolute price, but what matters is the price of renewables relative to the price of fossil fuels. That is what drives the costs of emission reduction. And that means that if you believe that the price of oil is going to come down in the future, then it will be expensive to reduce emissions. But if you believe that the price of oil is going to go up in the future, then it will be less expensive to reduce emissions. So that is the fourth reason. The fifth reason is that these relative price changes are not exogenous to policy. They actually respond to policy. And the question is how? And again, reasonable people can reasonably disagree about these matters. In some models, the assumption is that if we impose a climate policy now, if we put a carbon tax on our emissions now, then as a result, people will start investing in R&D and make future emission reduction cheaper. They will simply start working harder on developing alternatives to fossil fuels. And if you believe that, then a little bit of carbon tax, a little bit of climate policy now will not just reduce emissions now, but will also make emission reduction in the future cheaper. and that brings down the total cost of emission reduction for the entire century, the net present value. Um, there are So that is what is in some of these models. In other models, they say, well, actually, how do you reduce the costs of greenhouse gas emission reduction? Well, if you look at the automotive sector, one thing that you could do is make engines more fuel efficient, and that essentially means that you need more engineers improving those engines, more engineers working on the design of engines and the aerodynamics of cars and all those sort of things. And if they do so, then cars will become more fuel efficient. The question is, where do those engineers come from? Engines have been around, or internal combustion engines have been around for 130 years or so now, and a lot of engineers have worked on this already. So they're actually fairly good. So it's not that you just can walk in and say, well, I'm gonna improve the engine. No, even if you're a genius, you can't, because so many very smart people have worked on this already. It is actually difficult to improve. So what you need is not just put additional bodies on, but you need to put additional smart bodies on. And the question is, where do they come from? And if you believe that the market for innovation is very distorted, that there's brilliant taxi drivers out there who would have been able to improve engines but can't for some reason, and therefore they drive taxis. But if the demand for automotive engineers increases, then these people will be pulled out of their taxis and into the factories and into the R&D labs. Then it is not particularly costly to do this. But if you instead assume that all the smartest people in the world are already employed, then the implication is that if you kind of increase the rate of technological progress in energy, then necessarily you're going to pull smart people away from the smart things that they would have done otherwise. And that means that you're going to reduce the rate of technological progress in the rest of the economy. Because people that would have worked on medicine or would have worked on communication technologies or whatever are now working on energy. And if you believe that, then actually emission reduction becomes more expensive again. Because recall, energy is about 2% of the economy, and we can accelerate technological progress in energy, but that will not bring a lot of economic growth because it's only 2%. But if the price of accelerating the rate of technological progress in the energy sector is a deceleration, even a tiny deceleration of the rate of technological progress in the 98% that is the rest of the economy, then the cost of that will be fairly large. And reasonable people can reasonably disagree on all of these points, and the empirical evidence in many cases is not particularly conclusive, and that explains why there is such a wide range of results from models, even if you run them under controlled conditions. One of the reasons is, as I said, the calibration of these models and the parameter choices that they make. A related problem here is that most climate policy analysis is ex ante. That is, we talk about the implications of future climate policy. There have been relatively few studies of what are the costs of past climate policy. And one of the reasons is that there isn't a lot of past climate policy. Sweden started its carbon tax about 30 years ago, but most countries were much slower to adopt serious climate policies. There isn't a whole lot of evidence. But part of the reason is also that it's a bit of a blind spot in the climate economics literature, that everybody's doing ex-ante analysis, and that is what gets you published. And actually ex-post analyses are still fairly rare. So even though we are gaining experience, real life experience with emission reduction policies, there is a bit of a lack of policy evaluations of past policies. And that means that these models are fairly unconstrained by data.